This is episode 22 of the Rise Up podcast. We're a morning radio show hosted by Steve, Terese, and Tim on Family Life, a network of stations across New York and Pennsylvania. Our podcast is a weekly conversation that will help you think and grow in your faith. If you haven't already, subscribe today so you don't miss a single episode, and find out more about our show at familylife.org.
Feel free to stick around a while. We love it when you're here. This is Rise Up with Steve, Terese, and Tim on Family Life.
Let's talk about a topic that we don't have a lot of experience recently about. Of course, that narrows it down to about 300 subjects, probably. But in this case, it's singleness and being single. It's been 33 years since I've been single, and a little less for each of you. But when you're not single, sometimes you're like, okay, well, what can I say? Because there's single people listening right now. They're going like, you don't understand.
Yeah, right.
You're not in the midst of what I'm going through. So anybody want to tackle this first, singleness?
Well, and I feel like that awkwardness is a big part of it, because somehow as married people, we feel like we don't have anything to say about singleness, and so we just don't talk about it. And I feel like that's what a big part of the church does. We spend sermons on Sundays talking about marriage, talking about family, but when was the last time a pastor stood up in front of a full congregation and spoke on singleness?
Right.
It hardly ever happens. I don't know if I've ever sat through a message on singleness. And meanwhile, all of our single friends sit through those sermons on marriage and on child rearing and on relationships, and they're just there.
And I've heard a lot of those sermons that are preached, well-meaning, but they often start with something like, now, if this doesn't apply to you now, it will someday, and gives single people the impression that, well, it could go two ways. One, it could be hopeful for somebody who's really hoping for that, but for somebody else, it might make them feel, do I not have value until I'm going to be married? Or if I'm not going to be a family person someday, does that mean that I'm somehow less than or not measuring up or not part of this family? And I had a single friend who referred to the singleness groups in his church experience as being pre-marriage groups. That really bothered him a lot because he thought, well, why don't we have singles ministry that ministers to single people like myself where we are at, instead of treating us as people who are just trying to become the next thing, become a different thing? Do we have value where we are right now as single people? And of course, the answer is yes.
We can learn from everybody. Tim, you mentioned the other day that age group, and I'm not talking about single or married right now, just age group itself, that young people can learn from the elders of the church. The older people in the church can learn from the younger people in the church. And I think the same situation that Terese just mentioned as far as from the pulpit, we can learn as married people from single people, and single people have just as much to contribute to the church as married people with or without kids and everything, all those in between. So it's a body. It's the body of Christ. It's everybody included, and that means single people, married people, and one should not be put and is not put above the other. The Bible talks about that. It's good to be single, right?
Right.
Not to mention that every Sunday we hear a sermon preached from something Paul wrote or something Jesus said. We're learning from a single person.
Right.
Exactly. Right. Like, we forget that Paul was a single person. Jesus was a single person. Now, did he speak about relationships? Absolutely. But it was more often than not just relationships with one another, how believers should treat believers, how believers should treat unbelievers, how we should treat our neighbors, all of those things. I read something really fascinating about singles. And I remember when I was single, I tried connecting with big churches because you figure it's a numbers game. Big churches are more likely to have a singles ministry. And if I'm single, I must connect with a singles ministry. And so a big church is more likely to have a lot of people in that ministry. So there's more likely to be people like me. And then I would get into these big churches and I would feel like a number and I would kind of get lost. So it didn't surprise me to read that never married singles prefer small churches. Specifically, they say they have a more fulfilling church experience if there are fewer than 100 people in that church. And it got me thinking about, well, what kind of churches are those? What's the vibe of that church? What makes a person feel like they have value in a church like that? And I think the key is just that there's an opportunity to serve and be a big part of the church. I mean, if there's 100 people in the church, one person is 1% of that church.
Yeah.
But if there's 1,200 people in the church, one person is a very small percentage of that church. And so it allows someone who's coming to church by themselves to feel like they're a bigger part of something. If you go to a smaller church, keep your eye open for people who are coming by themselves, help them feel welcome. And I think a lot of times those smaller churches, and this is, again, me making an assumption, but I don't think it's necessarily too far off base. A lot of times those are older churches, and you might see some of those other end of the spectrum singles. I mean, this research was based on never married, but you're more likely to probably see widows and widowers at some of those older, smaller churches. And there's value in that singleness too.
It's funny you mentioned, I was going to say, you brought up my next topic when you said that term was used, never married singles. And I think generally we most of us, when we think of singles, we think of the younger generation. But then there's also the never married, and that's okay too, and that's fine. But then, yes, what you just said, Terese, you get into the, we're all eventually, there are rare exceptions where both male and female, husband and wife die at the same time. That does happen, but that's rare. The majority, if you're married, eventually you'll be single for a little while, right? Yes, how do we approach those people as well? That's another ministry, and they have so much to offer. Even I can just imagine the people who are widow or widower ministering to the younger singles about what they've learned during their entire, journey of marriage, and they have so much to offer, and we should offer them. I think Terese hit the key. It's like keep your eye open, keep your antenna up for the singles, no matter what age.
And the Bible has so much to say about caring for widows in the church, and it wouldn't exclude widowers also being somebody who need to feel folded into the family of God. And that word family is something I think is really important here, because maybe it's an American thing, maybe it's just a Western thing in general. We're so individualistic, though. We think we're part of a family if we've got the white picket fence and the people who live in the same place that we pay a mortgage for. But according to the Bible, family isn't something that just happens when you get married and you sign some documents with the justice of the peace or somewhere the court recognizes. Family is what God established in Christ. And none of us are alone because of what he did. And I don't know if we always see ourselves with our church as being a family as much as that's somewhere I go with my family. And families go to this, and someday maybe I don't have a family right now, but when or if I do, I'll go to the church with my family. The Bible really wants us to see the church is our family. There's so much support, and there's so much, I think, validation that comes from you wherever part of life you might be happening to be in when you are able to see the church as the real family of God that it is.
There's something complete about that word family. It implies that you're finished, that you're whole. And so often I think singles are meant to feel unwhole. If you're talking about someone who's lost a spouse, they feel like a part of them is missing. If it's an unmarried person, they feel like somehow they aren't living up to their God-given potential if they're not married with a family. And it's interesting what Paul said about singles in 1 Corinthians. He says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single. He doesn't say, it's okay that you're single, or someday maybe you won't be single, or someday you'll be complete. No, he says this thing that you're in, it's good. And God can use singleness in a lot of different ways. A lot of people who are single have the ability to go and do things for the kingdom that people who have families, young kids, they can't. You may have financial freedom to be able to do things that people who have the responsibility of a family aren't able to. It's not just okay to be single or maybe someday to be single. No, the Bible says it is good to be single. And so walk in that knowing that you're whole already.
Loving money is putting it above God, or anything above God is a bad thing. Money itself is not bad. We all know it's the love
Sure.
Of money. And that can be for everything, including marriage. If your number one focus is marriage above God, putting that as a priority above God, well, marriage is an idol then, and that's not a good thing. Anything put above God is an idol. So no matter what it is, and this time we're talking, singleness, don't look at that as, don't be so focused everywhere you go. I have to find someone for me. I have to find that wholeness that Terese was talking about. I have to find, to make me complete. I have to. No, put God first. And he promises to direct your paths, always keeping God first in every situation.
Facing a whole new day is a lot easier when you remember that God is in charge. You're listening to Rise Up on Family Life.
The waves as they gently go over your feet, and the little birdies as they're singing. Oh, nature, it just can't help but sing. Whether we hear it or not, the waves, they're singing to God's glory. The birds, they do it every morning, regardless of what's going on. They're going to keep singing. And it turns out there's another melody in the universe that we've never been able to hear until just now. Listen to this. That's what they call a starquake. It's a sound that's been reverberating throughout the universe since God created. We've never been able to hear it, too sensitive for our ears, but scientists are clever. They found a way to compile all this together so we could finally hear a sound that represents what stars have been doing, singing to God's glory all along ever since he created this universe.
Wow, that sound. It's cool that it's the stars, but I've heard that sound before.
What?
I know.
Yeah,
I feel like that's the sound that Steve's stomach makes right before Nick's Picks You Can Fix every Wednesday morning.
But Nick's there, and it's always good.
We hope the rest of your day is just as much fun as this. You're listening to Rise Up on Family Life.
It was 30 years and just a little over 6 months ago. I'll never forget the feeling. Dad for the first time, and we brought Laura home, and I can picture myself still in the kitchen, holding her. Her head was in my hand. The rest of her legs were down about my mid-elbow.
Like the football.
Exactly, hold the football hold. And I looked at her and I said, what do we do now? I didn't know what to do. I mean, the first time, and you have the and I had a very similar feeling the other day. You ready for this?
What was that?
Now, I'm a city kid. I'm not much of a suburban kid. I'm not much of a country guy. So I was lost. I looked out in the yard, and I thought it was a big brown bag.
Uh-oh.
But no.
Uh-oh.
I found out, it was on further inspection, that it was a cute little speckled fawn, a baby. Had just been born on our side. And I had that same feeling. Well, what do I do now? Yeah. I didn't know. So I did the same thing I did over 30 years ago. Just let Mom take care of it.
Yeah.
Mom, always let Mom take care of it. It's the best thing to do.
Thanks for making us part of your morning routine. It's Rise Up with Steve, Terese, and Tim on Family Life.
If you feel that chill in the air, if you hear the sleigh bells in your brain, it's not your imagination. It is Christmas in June.
It is where?
In my garden. And here's the reason why. Okay. If you're like me and you have planted a ridiculous number of tomato plants and you know what's coming, that as soon as that fruit begins to form and turn red, and in come the birds, and they're like, that looks delicious. It's pretty funny. Actually, when your tomatoes get attacked, it's not for the food as much as the liquid, that it's like a source of hydration or water, you know? And so birds will come along and they peck at them, and they get out the liquid they want, and then off they go. And you're like, great, now we can't eat that. So Christmas in June, what you do is you get some of the red plastic Christmas ornaments from your stash, and you hang them on your tomato cages. Your neighbors will think that you're being grossly festive, but in reality, you are just trying to trick the birds because they take a couple pecks at those ornaments and they're like, this is fruitless.
I see what you did
And
there.
then they move on, and then you get to enjoy more of your tomatoes.
So unsatisfying for the poor birds, though.
That was fruitless.
Bird brains.
They're morning people because they love mornings and people. It's Rise Up with Steve, Terese, and Tim on Family Life.
That shouldn't be a record. That can't be a record. It's not a record. Oh, this can't be a record. Some cooks got together and made a 46-pound, 3.34 ounces, if you're going to be exact, chicken nugget. 46 pound. That's not a nugget. That's like that's a chicken boulder. Exactly. Now, if it's a record for a chicken boulder, fine, but it can't be a chicken nugget. 46 pounds.
I think when you get to the point where there are multiple chickens worth of meat going into it, you lose the nugget territory. You're past that at that point.
There's so many things about, like, they cut it up and they shared it, which means now you didn't get a nugget, you had like a chicken chunk. And if you didn't even get any of the breading part, does it count? And then how many extra dipping sauces and how much is that going to cost you?
And
right?
I mean, put the dipping sauces in like a bucket?
Well,
right, like the one-piece nug. I mean, nobody gets that, right?
No. Oh, no. I think you'd have to be slathering the sauce on, too, because the surface area. There's just a lot of problems. I think we really need to go to the board, whoever decided on this.
Who says we don't touch on the controversial topics here? Family Life, Rise Up. Chicken nugget. No way.
We might not know what God has planned for today, but we're going to face it together. This is Rise Up on Family Life.